Chapter 7. The two arrows, with one a little in the lead, arced away into the grey sky. Horace, watching their flight, lost sight of them against the clouds. He was conscious of the fact that Halt and Will had already nocked fresh arrows, ready for the next shot. Then, eyes intent on the burly figure at the claw's tiller, he caught a flicker of movement as the two arrows flashed down. He couldn't tell which arrow struck O'Malley. Halt was the better shot, Horace knew, but Will was nearly as skilled. One arrow thudded, quivering, into the bulwark less than a metre from the helm. The other buried itself painfully in the fleshy part of O'Malley's upper left arm, the side that was facing towards them. With the noise of the wind and sea, Horace couldn't hear the cry of pain from the smuggler, but he saw him stagger, releasing the tiller and clutching his injured left arm. The effect on the claw was almost instantaneous and disastrous. Free of the steadying pressure of the rudder holding her across the wind, she suddenly flew up ahead of the wind, her square sail bulging and ropes snapping like overtuned harpstrings with the increase in pressure as the force came from dead astern. The lurching of the ship threw O'Malley to the deck. At the same time, several oarsmen completely missed their stroke and tumbled backwards on the rowing benches. One oar came unshipped. Several others tangled with their neighbours. The result was chaos. The precise balance of forces that Halt had observed was totally disrupted. The claw swung wildly downwind, already passing astern of the Sparrow, rushing madly towards the boiling waters of Palisade Reef. One of the crew was lurching across the plunging deck, heading for the tiller, which was smashing back and forth, out of control. "Stop him, Will," Halt said briefly. They crossed to the opposite side of the deck, where they had a clearer view of the out-of-control smuggler ship. Again they shot. This time, both arrows found their mark, and the man pitched forward, rolling into the scuppers as the ship heeled. The Sparrow's captain watched, open-mouthed. "Nobody can shoot like that," he said softly. Horace, beside him, allowed himself a humourless smile. "These two can," he said. On board the Claw, the stricken crew realised that it was too late to save their ship from driving onto the reef. They began to scramble towards the raised stern, trying instinctively to avoid the point of first impact. Their ship, rolling wildly, struck the first of the rocks hidden below the seething water. There was a grating crash, and the ship shuddered, her movement checked for a moment. The mast bowed forward under the sudden impact, then snapped off clean, a metre above the deck. It came crashing down across the ship in a tangle of rope and canvas and splintered wood, crushing and trapping a few who had been caught beneath it. The extra weight to one side heeled the ship downwind, and that seemed to release it momentarily from the grip of the first rock. It surged upwards, staggered further into the tangle of the reef, and crashed hard against another black, jagged mass rising from the sea. A wave broke over the trapped hull, and several of the men on board were swept away. Halt and Will had lowered their bows. The bearded ranger turned now to the captain. "We should do something to help them," he said. The captain shook his head fearfully. "I can't take my ship down into that," he protested. "I'm not suggesting you do, but we could toss some barrels overboard to float down to them. It might give them a chance." Halt glanced coldly back towards the wrecked ship, "which is more than they would have given us." Horace nodded, grim-faced. The sight of the Claw, so recently a fast, agile creature of the water, now turned into a splintered, helpless wreck, was a terrible one indeed. but he knew the men on board had been willing to consign him, his friends, and the crew of the Sparrow to the exact same fate. At a word from the captain, some of the Sparrow's crewmen left the oars and began to heave empty casks over the rail, and he moved to help them. Soon a line of bobbing, floating barrels was drifting down towards the sinking ship. The captain turned to Halt, fear in his eyes. "I need my men back on the oars now," he said, "or we'll join them on the reef." Halt nodded. "We've done all we can for them. Let's get out of here." The sailors scrambled back to their benches and began to heave on the oars again. Slowly, the Sparrow began to drag herself away from the dreadful reef. But it was a close-run thing. One of the jagged rocks passed a few meters by their bow and was actually hidden by the port bulwark as they surged past it, emerging a few minutes later in their wake. Horace shuddered at the sight of it. He had no idea how they'd missed it, and in his mind's eye he could see the Sparrow suddenly smashing into it, pinned to the rock by the wind, slewing round, her mast crashing down under the shock. Men hurled in all directions as the grey waves broke over the deck. He shook the image away as they crept closer to safety. Then he felt a strange sensation as the wind on his right cheek faltered and died, to be replaced by a gust from the left, then another, then a steady breeze. They'd reached the backlift. "Go about!" the captain was yelling, and the crew left the oars and rushed to the halyards. The big square sail began to swing ponderously, then filled with a loud crack on the opposite tack. As if she were aware of the danger she had just faced, the Sparrow surged gratefully away from the reef. They beached the ship on the southern bank of the wide river mouth, running her prow into the sand so that she gradually eased to a halt. As the crew rigged a sling to the mast to haul the 3 horses overboard, the captain confronted Halt. "You should have told me," he said accusingly. "You should have told me O'Malley was an enemy." Surprisingly, Halt merely nodded. "You're right," he said, "but I knew you'd never take us if I did, and I needed to get here." The captain shook his head and began to say something further. Then he hesitated, remembering the uncanny skill of the 2 bowmen when they had sent their arrows streaking across the water at the smuggler's ship. Perhaps it might not do to show too much indignation with such men, he thought. Halt saw the struggle on his face and touched his arm gently. He understood the man's feelings, and he had to admit to himself that he had used him and his crew, and he had put them all in danger. "I'd pay you more," he said apologetically, "but I need all the gold I have left." He thought for a moment, then said, "Bring me a pen and paper." The skipper hesitated for a moment, then, as Halt urged him with a nod of his head, he disappeared into the low cabin at the stern. It was several minutes before he emerged, with a ragged-edged sheet of vellum and a writing quill and inkhorn. He had no idea what Halt intended, and his expression said as much. Halt took the writing implements, looked around for somewhere to rest the paper, and saw the capstan set in the foredeck of the ship. He walked to it, the captain trailing him curiously, and spread the paper on the flat, scarred wooden surface. The top of the inkhorn was stuck in place by dried ink, and it took him some seconds to pry it loose. "What's your name?" he said suddenly. The question took the captain by surprise. "Keelty, Ardell Keelty." Halt thought for a second or two, then wrote quickly. He covered the vellum with 6 lines, leaned back to read what he had written, his head at a slight angle, then nodded, satisfied. He signed the sheet with a flourish and waved it in the air to allow the ink to dry. Then he handed it to the captain, who looked at it and shrugged. I'm no great hand at reading, he said. Halt nodded. It explained the length of time it had taken Keelty to find pen and paper, and the state of the inkhorn. He took the paper back and read it aloud. Captain Keelty and the crew of the ship Sparrow have been instrumental in the taking and sinking of the notorious pirate and smuggling ship Claw off the coast of Picta. I request that these men be given a suitable reward from the royal coffers. Signed, Halt, Araluen Rangers. He looked up and added, It's addressed to King Sean. Present it to him and he'll make it worth your while. The captain snorted derisively as Halt handed him the sheet again. King Sean? Never heard of him. Ferris is the king of Clonmel. Ferris is dead, Horace put in. He wanted to spare Halt the anguish of discussing his brother's death. We're following the men who killed him. His nephew Sean has taken the throne. The captain turned to Horace. He was mildly surprised at the news of the king's death. Fingal Bay was a long way from the capital, after all. He looked sceptically at the words Halt had written. So, if he has, he said, why should this new king take any notice of you? Because he's my nephew, Halt told him. His dark eyes burned into Keelty's, and the captain knew, instinctively, that he was telling the truth. Then a further thought struck him. But you said he was Ferris's nephew, he said. So that means you're... He stopped, not sure if his line of thinking was correct, not sure if he was missing something. It means I'm keen to get off this rolling tub of bilge water and be on my way, Halt said briskly. He glanced around, saw that Will had brought their packs and saddles up from the small sleeping berth they had shared. He nodded his thanks and moved to the bow. The sailors had placed a ladder so that the 3 passengers could negotiate the 2-meter drop to the sand more easily. Halt swung a leg over the bulwark and looked back at Keelty, standing with the sheet of paper fluttering in the wind. Don't lose that, he admonished him. Keelty, his mouth open as he tried to put all the factors together, nodded absently. I won't. Halt looked at his 2 companions. Let's go, he said, and ran lightly down the ladder to the sand. He was grateful to have the feeling of solid ground under his feet once more.